Please subscribe to the channel to watch the latest videos.
Trump pledges to turn away those who don't like our religion. Donald Trump is not understood to be a particularly religious person. When he launched his candidacy for the 2016 Republican nomination, he would insist that the Bible was his favorite book, edging out The Art of the Deal, although he was unable to identify a favorite passage or, at times, demonstrate much familiarity with it. As president, he rarely went to church, one exception being when, on June 1, 2020, he strode across a newly cleared Lafayette Square to pose outside St. John's Episcopal Church holding a Bible. This is most obviously how Trump's life intersects with religion. He understands that it is a motivation for Americans, particularly Americans who are inclined to support him politically. During a speech in Iowa in January 2016, he lamented that Christianity is under tremendous siege and pledged to be the religious rights champion in office. Which, for the most part, he very much was. There was a flip side to this, too. It wasn't just that Christians were imperiled, it was that people of other religions were inherently dangerous. He leveraged the existence of the Islamic State and terrorist attacks in France and San Bernardino, California, to cast Muslim immigrants as dangerous. In December 2015, he proposed a ban on Muslim migrants. It was typical of the moment, sparking a huge outcry, including from his eventual vice presidential pick, and seeming as though he'd crossed an uncrossable line. But the Republican electorate drew no such line, and Trump, as president, tried to figure out how to make his promise a reality. By now, there is no surprise inherent when Trump and other candidates for the 2024 Republican nomination paint non-Christians with a broad, defamatory brush. For example, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Republican, argued that not all refugees from the Gaza Strip support Hamas, the group that launched terrorist raids into Israel this month, but they are all anti-Semitic. None of them believe in Israel's right to exist. This is not true. Trump, speaking in New Hampshire on Monday evening, went further, as he is wont to do. On day one, I will immediately restore and expand the Trump travel ban, he pledged to the cheering crowd. He interrupted his prepared remarks for a riff about how his opponents tried to stop his ban in the courts, which they did successfully to an extent. Then he continued, he would also halt all of the refugee settlements to the United States. They want to come and they want to bring, the same people that are shooting rockets at Israel, they want to come into the United States, Trump said. I don't think a lot of good things are going to happen. This, too, is not true, as Nikki Haley, a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, said in response to DeSantis's comments, American immigration policy includes recognition that you can separate civilians from terrorists. Then Trump again expanded his rhetoric. I will implement strong ideological screening of all immigrants, he said, reading from the teleprompter. If you hate America, if you want to abolish Israel, he continued, apparently ad-libbing, if you don't like our religion, which a lot of them don't, if you sympathize with the jihadists, then we don't want you in our country and you are not getting in. Right? The crowd cheered enthusiastically. Trump vamped, we don't want you. Get out of here. You're fired. This is not sophisticated political rhetoric, quite the opposite. It's demagoguery. But it is also revealing. After all, what is our religion in this nation built by people seeking freedom of religious expression? We all know the answer, but let's explore the question as if we don't know. The Public Religion Research Institute's annual assessment of American religious identity shows that about 2/3 of Americans are Christian. About a quarter are religiously unaffiliated, most of them not religious at all. Religious identity, and particularly Christian religious identity, is more common among Republicans. But that religiosity has slipped since 2006. Then, about 94% of Republicans were Christian. Now, about 85% are. The percentage of Republicans who are religiously unaffiliated more than doubled over that time. Younger Americans are less religious than older Americans, contributing to the sense, exploited by Trump, that the country is moving away from the traditions in which older Americans grew up. But most young Americans still are Christian. This is all Trump is getting at. Our religion, the religion of those in the room at his event, is right-wing, often evangelical Christianity. In 2020, the density of white Christians in a county was a very good indicator of whom voters in the county supported. But let's take this one step further. Is our religion simply right-wing Protestantism? Are Catholics included under Trump's religious umbrella? Where is the line drawn? There were fewer than 60,000 immigrants from Palestinian territories living in the United States in 2020, according to data presented by the Migration Policy Institute. By contrast, there were 2.7 million immigrants from India, where 80% of the population is Hindu. Will a second Trump administration turn away immigrants from the world's most populous country as well? What about Eastern Orthodox Christians from Ukraine? Parsing Trump's comments is excessive, of course, as stipulated, we know what he means. He means that certain categories of people are inherently dangerous and unacceptable: Hispanic people coming to the United States across our southern border, Arab people who are fleeing violence in the Middle East. He is saying, once again, that he will defend American Christians against perceived threats that might be framed in vague religious terms but which are not fundamentally religious. Trump is saying, once again, that he will serve as a backstop against an erosion of power felt by a subset of Americans. He is telling those Americans, white Christian conservatives, that he will make them the focus of America's protective power. The crowd supported this idea enthusiastically. Nikki Haley might have an ace in the hole: independent voters. Nikki Haley, despite riding a wave of support following her two outstanding debate performances, faces a near-impossible path to overtake Donald Trump. But the former UN ambassador might have an ace in the hole that could confound experts: independent voters. Haley has become the latest new thing for Republicans desperate to defeat the former president. She is now a clear third in Iowa, and she has surpassed Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to move into second in New Hampshire. Her fundraising is also picking up steam, raising $11 million from July to September across her various committees. In other words, she has what every other challenger lacks: forward momentum. Her problem is that even that is not likely to be enough to unseat King Donald. The former president not only leads her by 50 points, but also is likely to crush her in a one-on-one race. A recent poll by FairVote and WPA Intelligence demonstrates this. It uses ranked choice voting, which asks respondents to rank all the candidates in order of preference. The pollsters then remove the lowest-scoring candidates one by one, reallocating their supporters to those voters' next highest choices. This allows the pollsters to test every challenger Trump might face in a one-on-one scenario. Trump, who received 48% of first-choice votes, beats them all. He also annihilated Haley 62-38 when the rest of the field was winnowed out. That's mainly because 40% of DeSantis voters named Trump as their second choice, and others surely ranked Trump ahead of Haley on their ballot. That shouldn't be surprising, given her campaign strategy. Her position on abortion, avoid federal abortion bans that cannot obtain Democratic support, is not what pro-life voters want to hear. She strongly supports continued military aid to Ukraine and is very hawkish toward Iran. She might have served in Trump's administration, but she is clearly running on a pre-Trump Republican platform. If polls are right, that means Haley's hopes are doomed even if she becomes Trump's final challenger. Momentum might close the gap, but a party that has consistently chosen the Trumpier candidate in recent party primaries won't abandon Trump Classic. But there is a possibility that the polls are massively wrong. If last year's GOP primaries in Georgia are any indication, Haley's chances might be higher than expected. Trump went all in to defeat Republican Governor Brian Kemp and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger because of their refusal to interfere in Georgia's 2020 election results. He endorsed their opponents and held rallies in the state. He argued that they caved to Democrats and allowed them to steal the election from him. That belief is false, but early polls suggested it was effective, reducing the incumbent governor's lead to only 19 points, according to the Real Clear Politics polling average. In the end, Kemp won by 52 points. That's one of the biggest polling errors in history. It's easy to understand why this happened in retrospect. Turnout in 2020 nearly doubled from the last contested gubernatorial primary, from 607,000 in 2018 to roughly 1.2 million, breaking previous turnout records. Clearly, pollsters surveyed habitual GOP voters and missed the less committed voter who nonetheless turned out to defeat Trump's endorsees. Haley's hopes rest on replicating this feat. She already tends to poll better among moderates and independents. If that trend grows, she can position herself as the only person who could prevent a Trump-Biden rematch, which voters are desperate to avoid. She doesn't have to become a liberal to accomplish this, she simply would have to do what Kemp did, show she is a sensible conservative who could stand in the way of Trump's tirades. This strategy would focus on the 31 states and territories that either do not have party registration, such as Georgia, or that allow registered independents to vote in Republican primaries, such as New Hampshire. These states have a combined 1,322 Republican delegates, a majority of the 2,470 that will attend the GOP convention. Win most of these, and some of the states elected only by Republicans, and Haley could eke out a majority on the convention floor. It's a narrow path to the nomination, but it's not impossible. Former House Speaker Thomas P. Tip O'Neill Jr. frequently told a story about neighbors who knew him for years but never voted for him, simply because he never asked them to. Haley might assume that she'll win the support of Trump-hating independents naturally, but she'll probably have to ask them to show up. She could upend the GOP race if she does. On Israel, DeSantis acted while Trump just acted out. When the full history of the Israel-Gaza war is written, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' decision to partner with a nonprofit that specializes in bringing U.S. citizens home from conflict zones will be just a small detail. But that decision not only helped bring 270 U.S. citizens from Tel Aviv to Tampa, it also put on vivid display the sort of stark choices facing Republicans as the 2024 GOP primary season looms. The Florida state government's airlift partner was Project Dynamo, a veteran-led organization formed to help rescue people in Afghanistan after the United States withdrew troops in 2021. The group also aided the evacuation of Americans from Ukraine after Russia's 2022 invasion. Florida's move, after the massive Hamas attack on October 7, was a calculated gamble. Hamas claimed responsibility for a rocket attack targeting Israel's Ben Gurion International Airport, and many airlines suspended flights to and from Israel. The Miami Herald noted that Tampa-based Project Dynamo has been criticized by U.S. government officials for being too willing to take risks. But there wasn't any risk-free option for getting these people out. They had to live with the risk of trying to leave through the evacuation flight, or live with the risks of staying as Hamas rockets targeted Israel. I think if you were watching, you saw a lot of families with young kids. So, a lot of these people were in a real pinch. They had no help. They were not able to get out of Israel, and the state of Florida stepped up, DeSantis told reporters. Governors can't do a lot when there's a terrible foreign policy crisis, but DeSantis figured out a way to help Floridians stuck in Israel. Most GOP presidential candidates issued a statement denouncing Hamas and pledging support for Israel, but DeSantis managed to actually do something. Even if it was only the relatively minor matter of getting 179 adults, 91 children and 2 dogs out of harm's way, he earned the right to take a bow. Contrast that with Donald Trump, far and away the most likely Republican presidential nominee. For days after the Hamas attack, the former president leapt into action, praising Israel's enemies as very smart and venting his spleen about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu supposedly backing out of helping with the ultimately successful U.S. drone strike in 2020 against top Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. Trump was at his Mar-a-Lago resort in South Florida, making long, rambling remarks to his adoring Club 47 fan club. I'll reproduce them here at length, to provide the full, statesmanlike flavor. I'll never forget that Bibi Netanyahu let us down, that was a very terrible thing, I will say that. And, so when I see, sometimes, the intelligence, you talk about the intelligence, or you talk about some of the things that went wrong over the last week, they've got to straighten it out because they're fighting, potentially, a very big force, they're fighting potentially Iran, and when they have people saying the wrong things, everything they say is being digested by these people, because they're vicious and they're smart, and boy are they vicious, because nobody's ever seen the kind of sight that we've seen, nobody's ever seen it, but they cannot play games, so we were disappointed by that, very disappointed, but we did the job ourselves, and it was absolute precision and magnificent, beautiful job, and then, Bibi tried to take credit for it, that didn't make me feel too good, but that's all right. Note that Trump didn't explain why the United States would need Israeli cooperation or sign off on an effort to take out an Iranian figure on Iraqi soil. And, in any case, NBC News reported, after the speech, that 3 U.S. officials familiar with the operation's planning said Trump's description was simply false. Israel was never going to participate in the strike, fearing it would be dangerous and destabilizing. Taking out Soleimani turned out to be a big U.S. military success, and yet here we are, more than 3 years later, with Trump airing grievances about an apparently imaginary betrayal when Israel is experiencing one of its darkest hours and worldwide fears of a greater conflict are palpable. DeSantis has shown some faults since announcing his bid for the Republican nomination, describing Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a territorial dispute was a boneheaded, self-inflicted wound. But he was re-elected in 2022 in a landslide because he gets things done for Floridians, which DeSantis decisively showed again with the Israel airlift. DeSantis might or might not turn out to be the best GOP alternative to Trump, but his recent conduct, in contrast with Trump's bellyaching about Israel, underlined what's at stake if Republicans continue on their current course. Trump is a fundamentally unserious person running for the presidency in a deadly serious world. Trump's rivals helped create him. They won't win without admitting it. I've always found Nikki Haley to be a dexterous politician, and when I hear her going off on Donald Trump like she did last week, you don't congratulate or give any credit to murderers, I think to myself, good for you. And immediately after that, I think, a little late, no? After all, Haley was Trump's United Nations ambassador when he stood next to Vladimir Putin and took the Russian dictator's side over that of his own intelligence agencies. She had no harsh words for him then, although she later claimed to have privately told him that it made her uncomfortable. Not so uncomfortable that she didn't stay the full term, serving up a bottomless supply of public validation. Haley might yet emerge as a serious threat to Trump's renomination. But if she doesn't, her failure to explain that 180-degree swerve could have something to do with it. By no means am I singling out Haley for scrutiny here. After Trump praised the terrorist group Hezbollah as smart and bashed Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for security failures, former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie said his party cannot once again nominate a fool like this to be our nominee and get him anywhere near the presidency of the United States. As someone who has followed Christie for more than a decade and interviewed him during the highs and lows, I actually think he'd make a decent president. We can argue this point some other time. But I'm not sure how we're supposed to forget that he was a crucial, early enabler of Trump back in 2016 and continued to stand by him for most of his presidency. I haven't. The way Christie likes to tell the story, he broke with Trump on election night, when it became clear that Trump would imperil our democracy. Well, okay. So the open embrace of white nationalists, on which Christie later based a book-length condemnation of Trump, wasn't enough? How about the defiant dismissiveness of a virus that killed more than 1 million Americans, and almost killed Christie, who contracted it while helping Trump prepare for debates? And where does former Vice President Mike Pence get off saying last week, with his usual self-conscious sobriety, that Trump's comments were reckless and irresponsible? This is the same man who spent 4 years extolling Trump as one of our greatest presidents and once showered him with praise 14 times during a televised cabinet meeting, which was just creepy. I should mention that Ron DeSantis is also a Trump admirer turned critic, although when I watch the Florida governor stamping his feet in debates now, I can't help thinking of the line uttered by Smithers after Homer Simpson loses his hair and shirks off the stage, "Dead man coming through." In some ways, the 2024 Republican campaign reminds me of the Democratic field in 2008, which was full of candidates, Joe Biden among them, who had voted to authorize the invasion of Iraq, only to find themselves opposing the war as presidential aspirants. At least those candidates concocted some creative rationales for why they had completely changed their minds. Not so with this year's Republicans, who seem to lack any persuasive answer for their inconstancy, and who aren't held accountable in any event. If I were a debate moderator, I'd make them go down the line explaining how it is that they could have so loyally stood by Trump in the past. And if their answer was anything other than "I made a cynical career calculation without regard for the country, and for that I'm truly sorry," I'd make them answer it again. But my larger point isn't that candidates are being expedient, that's like criticizing a bee for stinging. It's that I think their expediency might also be a big reason that none of them rival Trump in the polls, despite a chunk of Republicans harboring doubts about his ability to win. Because maybe the most consistent factor in Trump's appeal has been his contempt for phony politicians. This was Trump's argument in the debates 8 years ago, that although he might have been crass and shameless, all the other candidates were utterly without conviction. All they're doing now, these changeling Republican challengers, is proving him right. I suspect that when a lot of Republican voters see Haley and Christie and Pence slamming Trump, they see typical politicians who will say anything to get ahead, even it means completely reversing themselves and hoping no one notices. The only solution might be to stand up and say that you were wrong to have supported Trump in the first place. Taking some responsibility for the grotesque monster you created might be the only way the townspeople are ever going to trust you to dismantle it. Trump and today's repulsive politics echo George Wallace in 1968. The presidential candidate was a harbinger of the future that became our ghastly present. He carried plastic-tipped White Owl cigars in the breast pocket of his short-sleeved white shirts, greeted individual voters "How you doin', partner," and had a campaign manager with the name Turnipseed, but a negligible campaign structure to manage. Perhaps the most astonishing grassroots uprising in U.S. history put his name on 50 states' ballots. He drew 18,000 listeners to Boston Common in Hawthorne and Emerson's New England, far from Alabama. Misery loves gloomy precedents, reassurances that there have been times when a nation's political life was as repulsive as it now is. So try Chapman University historian Luke A. Nichter's The Year That Broke Politics, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968. Nichter argues that George Wallace, with his class-based message, created a lasting movement. In 1968, North Vietnamese deaths in 3 weeks of the Tet Offensive, perhaps 50,000, almost matched U.S. deaths in 8 war years but shattered Americans' support for the war. U.S. urban chaos, however, following 2 assassinations, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in April, Robert F. Kennedy in June, displaced the war as the dominant issue. Wallace was elected Alabama governor in 1962, propelled by full-throated racism, which also characterized his test run in the 1964 Democratic presidential primaries. But by the mid-1960s, he was, Nichter says, a New Deal-inspired Southern populist, a demagogue first and a segregationist second. His antic and comic rhetoric, e.g., against briefcase-toting bureaucrats who can't park a bicycle straight, would have echoes in 2016. The major 1968 candidates were all from working-class families: Vice President Hubert Humphrey, the son of a struggling Wallace, South Dakota, pharmacist; Richard M. Nixon, the last president born in a home without electricity or running water; Wallace, son of a farmer in Hardscrabble Barber County. The working class would define 1968. Starting with Lyndon B. Johnson, 5 of 8 presidents were to come from former Confederate states. But Wallace had an epiphany from Wisconsin. In 1964, that state's governor worried that the state would be tarnished if Wallace received 100,000 votes in its primary. He received 266,984. This startled both national parties more than they would be again until 2016. Wallace launched his 1968 campaign not in Dixie but in western Pennsylvania, where Donald Trump romped in 2016 and 2020. To get Wallace on California's ballot, his supporters there each had to complete a 2-page legal form by December 31, 1967. Ohio's Secretary of State was so given to invalidating signatures, Wallace supporters had to get 100,000 more than the 433,000 required. A spontaneous combustion of popular support prevailed everywhere. Evangelist Billy Graham said he thought that presidents are divinely chosen, but he also believed that the Almighty needed his assistance in 1968. More peripatetic than consequential, Graham fawned over Johnson, who almost seems to have favored Nixon, as Graham did. Graham, however, called Wallace one of the finest orators of the 20th century. This judgment was in anticipation of evangelicals jettisoning their standards in 2016. In 1968, Nichter reports, a senior Humphrey advisor warned of blue-collar defections. The group that we have often depended upon as the backbone of the Democratic vote is leaving us by the droves. Humphrey, however, almost won with the help of a former plumber. On September 29, 1968, Gallup showed Nixon at 43%, Humphrey 28%, Wallace 21%. On October 9, Gallup showed Nixon 44, Humphrey 29, Wallace 20. George Meany was, however, head of the AFL-CIO, and 30% of private sector workers were unionized. Today, 6% are. Meany energized his coast-to-coast membership from coast to coast, and on October 24, Gallup showed Nixon 44, Humphrey 36, Wallace 15. On election day, Humphrey, having tardily shifted his focus from Vietnam to populism, lost the popular vote by 0.7 points. In 1948, less than 1% of Northerners supported South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond's Dixiecrat presidential candidacy. 20 years later, Nichter notes, about 8% supported Wallace, almost half of whose votes came from the North. For years after Johnson won 61% against Barry Goldwater, the Nixon-Wallace combined vote was 57%. Humphrey received 12 million votes fewer than Johnson had in 1964, although the U.S. population in 1968 was 8 million larger. Nichter believes that Wallace's 13.5% of the popular vote started a sustained movement that migrated into and eventually came to dominate the Republican Party. On Election Day 1968, Donald Trump was 22. How is the Republican presidential nominating fight not over? Not one single vote has been cast for the Republican Party's 2024 nominating contest yet, but it's hard to see how the fight isn't already over. Former President Donald Trump holds a huge national polling lead over his opponents, a lead that has little precedent in the last 40-plus years of contested Republican primaries. Perhaps more importantly, though, it's hard to imagine a scenario in which perhaps the best-known non-incumbent candidate for his party's nomination sees a sudden erosion in support large enough to cost him his lead. This question of Trump's lead and its durability was raised by an excellent report from my Washington Post colleagues this weekend, considering how Florida Governor Ron DeSantis's, Republican, once enviable position as the alternative to Trump had collapsed so dramatically that he is now trying to fend off Nikki Haley, the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, for second place in national polling. It is no longer the case that Trump and DeSantis are separated from the pack. Instead, an exhausted DeSantis has simply been folded into the chase group. Put another way, Haley is not challenging Trump for the nomination, but, instead, challenging DeSantis for the biggest participation trophy. ABC News's 538 polling analysis site has historic averages of national primary polling that we can compare to Trump's current position. Older Republican nominating contests had spottier polling, meaning that the averages aren't as extensive or volatile. But the comparison is nonetheless instructive. If we use the Iowa caucuses in each contested Republican nominating fight since 1980 as our point of reference, we see that Trump's current national lead was exceeded only once, by George W. Bush in the 2000 primaries. Bush, as you might be aware, went on to easily win his party's nomination. The next biggest lead in the average was held by Bob Dole in 1996. He also won the nomination. Both Dole and Bush also won the Iowa caucuses, which no other eventual Republican nominee has done in a contested primary campaign since 1980. Even Trump lost in Iowa in 2016, barely. He quickly pivoted to accusing the winner, Senator Ted Cruz, Republican, Texas, of cheating. This is important because DeSantis's strategy for winning the election appears to center on victory in Iowa. He shifted campaign staff there earlier this month, with various reports suggesting it will serve as his make-or-break point. His Alamo, perhaps. Should DeSantis eke out a win in the Hawkeye state, though Trump currently leads there by 30 points in 538's average, then what? Are Republicans suddenly going to think that he's a better bet for November and flip their support? It's certainly possible, but DeSantis has been making exactly that argument for months without one, polling backing up his arguments or two, gaining any ground against the former president. It's useful to remember that Trump's been here before. In 2016, he held the lead in Republican primary polling and went on to lose Iowa before securing the nomination. But his lead that year was never as robust as his lead is this time around. Back then, it was feasible to imagine that something could emerge that derailed his candidacy. In fact, such potential derailments were identified repeatedly, without actually derailing him. Now he's so well known by voters that the idea he might stumble seems much less likely. It's also useful to remember that the perennial "what if all but one Trump alternative drops out" strategy ignores one, that Trump's over 50% in national polling, and two, he's still the second choice for a lot of people who prefer his opponents. Again, no votes have yet been cast. But those arguing that Trump might not win would seem to have a fairly robust burden of proof to overcome. Sure, theoretically he could lose, just as, theoretically, the moon could spontaneously turn purple. If you're arguing that the moon will do that, I'd be interested to hear how. Likewise for the idea that Trump won't be the GOP's 2024 nominee. The bipartisan fear that American democracy is on the brink. In a few weeks, Americans will go to the polls, a small percentage of them will, anyway, to vote for state and local level political issues and candidates. It's one of the purer forms of democratic involvement, offering one's thoughts on things that are outside the spotlight of national attention, things that are more directly influential on their daily lives. Most of those casting ballots early next month will be doing so while simultaneously fretting that American democracy is under threat. That's clear from Grinnell College polling released last week. Most Americans believe that the country's democracy is facing a major threat, include those saying it's facing a minor threat, and 4 in 5 say so. That position, particularly the more extreme version of it, is more common among Republicans. Nearly 2/3 of Republicans think that American democracy is facing a major threat, a finding that might surprise those on the left who consider the presidency and subsequent candidacy of Donald Trump as the trigger for their concern. But another question in the poll helps explain the concern. Asked whether they are confident that the final count in the 2024 elections will match voter intent, most Americans said they were, at least somewhat. Most Republicans didn't, with only about 1 in 8 saying they were very confident the count would match the will of voters. This is the rampant election fraud position. The results of an election are suspect because of concern that the votes or the vote counting have been manipulated. It is the position Trump holds in respect to 2020, of course, but this poll suggests that he will come into his probable 2024 general election campaign with his allies already suspicious that the results can be trusted. That could prove to be an enormous asset to Trump, should he again be defeated by President Biden and again seek to stoke doubt about that loss to obtain the presidency. Which, of course, is the flip side of concerns about the threat to democracy. In its 2023 American Values Survey published Wednesday, the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, asked respondents specifically about the threats to democracy posed by Biden and Trump. Most Americans thought that both candidates posed such a threat, or, at least, to a threat to American democracy and way of life. As you might expect, there is a partisan divide. Democrats mostly think that Trump's election poses such a threat, Republicans, that Biden's does. About a fifth of each party thinks that their own candidate's election poses such a threat. PRRI also asked a more pointed version of the question: if either candidate wins, that means that American democracy is already broken. Here, fewer Americans held that position, but it was more common that respondents thought that of a Trump victory than a Biden one. According to these results, then, a Biden re-election would lead just under 4 in 10 Americans to think that democracy had broken. A Trump victory would cause 45% of Americans to feel that way. A third of the country would view the results as a marker not of democracy working, but at failing to work. Perhaps those engaging in democracy at a local level, without the churn and agitation that accompanies presidential politics, will be more likely to feel that the system, however flawed, remains functional. Candidates, take this AI election pledge. Or 2024 might break us. The first AI election is here. Here are the ground rules we need. New York Mayor Eric Adams doesn't speak Spanish. But it sure sounds like he does. He's been using artificial intelligence software to send pre-recorded calls about city events to residents in Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, Urdu, and Yiddish. The voice in the messages mimics the mayor but was generated with AI software from a company called 11 Labs. People stop me on the street all the time and say, "I didn't know you speak Mandarin," Adams said at a news conference this month. Experts have warned for years that AI will change our democracy by distorting reality. That future is already here. AI is being used to fabricate voices, fundraising emails, and deepfake images of events that never occurred. Ahead of the 2024 election, I'm writing this to urge elected officials, candidates, and their supporters to pledge not to use AI to deceive voters. I'm not suggesting a ban, but rather calling for politicians to commit to some common values while our democracy adjusts to a world with AI. Some lawmakers are trying to update our laws, but waiting on them to succeed isn't an option for the AI election that's already underway, experts in technology and elections tell me. If we don't draw some lines now, legions of citizens could be manipulated, disenfranchised, or lose faith in the whole system, opening doors to foreign adversaries who want to do the same. AI might break us in 2024. When it becomes weaponized, we're in a world of trouble, Representative Yvette D. Clarke, Democrat, New York, tells me. A wide 85% of U.S. citizens said they were very or somewhat concerned about the spread of misleading AI video and audio, in an August survey by YouGov. And 78% were concerned about AI contributing to the spread of political propaganda. Of course, fibbing politicians are nothing new, but examples keep multiplying of how AI supercharges misinformation in ways we haven't seen before. 2 examples, the presidential campaign of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Republican, shared an AI-generated image of former President Donald Trump embracing Anthony S. Fauci. That hug never happened. In Chicago's mayoral primary, someone used AI to clone the voice of candidate Paul Vallis in a fake news report, making it look like he approved of police brutality. Both of these cases could be debunked. But what will happen when a shocking image or audio clip goes viral in a battleground state shortly before an election? What kind of chaos will ensue when someone uses a bot to send out individually tailored lies to millions of different voters? Most voters would be shocked to see how simple and effective generative AI tools have become. At a recent live Washington Post event, I created a fake announcement from Senate Majority Leader Charles E. Schumer, Democrat, New York, endorsing Spider-Man for president. Schumer, who was in the audience, gave me permission to try. With an image generator called Midjourney, I made a photorealistic image of Spidey and the senator shaking hands. Using the same 11 Labs software that was used by New York's mayor, I had Schumer's voice read an endorsement. It all took me less than 15 minutes. The risk to our democracy is greater than just misinformation about any particular candidate. When faking becomes so easy, citizens can lose faith that anything they hear or say is legitimate. The ability of AI to interfere with our elections, to spread misinformation that's extremely believable, is one of the things that's preoccupying us, Schumer said, after watching me so easily create a deep fake of him. Lots of people in the Congress are examining this. Where to draw the line? So if we're clear on the risk of AI, what's in the way of solutions? There is nothing wrong with the use of AI in our democracy as long as it's not weaponized to deceive, misinform or harm anyone, says Clarke, who has been working for years on developing guardrails for AI. She's right, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. AI is already embedded in tech tool campaigns that all of us use every day. AI creates our Facebook feeds and picks what ads we see. AI built into our phone cameras brightens faces and smooths skin. What's more, there are many political uses for AI that are unobjectionable, and even empowering for candidates with fewer resources. Politicians can use AI to manage the grunt work of sorting through databases and responding to constituents. Republican presidential candidate Asa Hutchinson has an AI chatbot trained to answer questions like him. I'm not sure politician bots are very helpful, but fine, give it a try. Clarke's solution, included in a bill she introduced on political ads, candidates should disclose when they use AI to create communications. You know the "I approve this message" notice? Now add, "I used AI to make this message." You know the "I approve this message" notice? Now add, "I used AI to make this message." I think disclosure is a piece of the solution. A visible or audible label lets campaigns be creative, but removes some of the risk in their tendency to stretch the truth. Embedded digital watermarks would also help sites like Google know to treat these images differently from news photos. The Republican National Committee included a disclaimer in an entirely AI-generated ad it released in April depicting a post-apocalyptic America following the re-election of President Biden and Vice President Harris. Because of it, I don't think anybody mistakenly thought the ad depicted reality. But labels aren't enough. If AI disclosures become commonplace, we may become blind to them, like so much other fine print. The bigger ask, we want candidates and their supporting parties and committees not to use AI to deceive us. So what's the difference between a dangerous deepfake and an AI facetune that makes an octogenarian candidate look a little less octogenarian? The core definition is showing a candidate doing or saying something they didn't do or say, says Robert Weissman, president of the nonprofit Public Citizen, which proposed an AI pledge of its own. Sure, give Biden or Trump a Facetune, or even show them shaking hands with Abraham Lincoln. But don't use AI to show your competitor hugging an enemy or fake their voice commenting on current issues. The pledge also includes not using AI to suppress voting, such as using an authoritative voice or image to tell people a polling place has been closed. That is already illegal in many states, but it's still concerning how believable AI might make these efforts seem. And add to that, don't deepfake yourself. Making yourself or your favorite candidate appear more knowledgeable, experienced, or culturally capable is also a form of deception. The voice clones of Adams, the New York mayor, were used to encourage people to apply for city jobs or attend community events, not to appeal for votes. Still, they contained no disclaimer that the voice was AI-generated and may have left a lasting impression with future voters. When former Mayor Mike Bloomberg wanted to connect with more New Yorkers, he took Spanish lessons at City Hall. Pressed on the ethics of his use of AI, Adams just proved my point that we desperately need some ground rules. These are part of the broader conversations that the philosophical people will have to sit down and figure out, is this ethically right or wrong? I've got one thing, I've got to run the city, he said. The golden rule in my pledge, don't use AI to be materially deceptive, is similar to the one in an AI regulation proposed by a bipartisan group of lawmakers including Senators Amy Klobuchar, Democrat, Minnesota, and Josh Hawley, Republican, Missouri. It would make distributing such misleading material illegal for federal candidates. Such proposals have faced resistance in Washington on First Amendment grounds. The free speech of politicians is important. It's not against the law for politicians to lie, whether they're using AI or not. An effort to get the Federal Election Commission to count AI deepfakes as fraudulent misrepresentation under its existing authority has faced similar pushback. But a pledge like the one I outline here isn't a law restraining speech. It's asking politicians to take a principled stand on their own use of AI. We know AI is something voters are concerned about, maybe leading on it will help some candidates get elected. Schumer said he thinks my pledge is just a start of what's needed. Maybe most candidates will make that pledge. But the ones that won't will drive us to a lower common denominator, and that's true throughout AI, he said. If we don't have government-imposed guardrails, the lowest common denominator will prevail. New Speaker Mike Johnson's 2020 election denial could have 2024 implications. Johnson worked behind the scenes to boost Donald Trump's efforts to stay in office through a long-shot court challenge. His role could matter after the next election. In the weeks after the 2020 election, an obscure Republican lawmaker from Louisiana led a congressional effort to overturn the presidential results in 4 battleground states that had helped secure Joe Biden's victory over Donald Trump. The victories were a sham, Mike Johnson argued, because state election officials had changed voting procedures, without first seeking legislative approval, to address the challenges of casting ballots during the coronavirus pandemic. Johnson recruited 125 House Republicans to join him in signing a U.S. Supreme Court brief saying as much, and on January 6, 2021, an even larger group of lawmakers, including Johnson, voted against certifying the Electoral College vote for Biden in 2 key battlegrounds. Johnson has never repudiated his part in any of it. On Wednesday, he was elected Speaker of the House. Johnson played one of the most significant roles of any member of Congress in the effort to overturn the election. But unlike some of his more bombastic colleagues, much of it was behind the scenes, through illegal filing, closed-door Republican Party strategy sessions, and private conversations with Trump. Now that Johnson has emerged as the next speaker in a vote that was celebrated Wednesday by Trump's MAGA movement, his role as a ringleader of efforts to overturn Biden's victory is generating new scrutiny. It is also prompting fresh attention to how Johnson could use his new job to influence the outcome of the next presidential election, should he still be Speaker in January 2025. Johnson on Wednesday declined to comment when asked whether he believed the 2020 election was stolen. "We're not talking about any issues today," he told the Washington Post after emerging with the Speaker's gavel following weeks of dysfunction led by the most fervent Trump loyalists within the House GOP. "My position is very well known. That position as an organizer of efforts to undermine the 2020 vote, in fact, is probably a key reason for his ascension. The caucus had balked the day before at elevating Tom Emmer, Minnesota, who was among the minority of House Republicans that voted to certify Biden's win. Johnson's bid was also aided by a genial nature that contrasted sharply with pro-Trump firebrand and ally Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio, whose quest for Speaker sputtered after moderates refused to back him. But experts said Johnson's more palatable disposition shouldn't disguise his willingness to meddle in the outcome of elections. Johnson looks a lot like Jim Jordan's revenge, said Austin Sherratt, a professor of law and political science at Amherst College. He is someone who is up to his neck in election denialism, and that does not bode well for what is likely to happen in the House. Democracy advocates and constitutional scholars are particularly concerned about what he could do in 2024, when Trump may once again be the Republican nominee for president and there's the possibility of yet another close election. Having somebody who took those steps in such a position of leadership going into yet another presidential election with quite likely the same people on the ballot is actually very troubling, said Genevieve Nadeau, a lawyer with Protect Democracy, a nonpartisan advocacy group for fair elections. Johnson's role in seeking to overturn the 2020 vote was directly solicited by Trump, who tapped the lawmaker, first elected the same year that Trump was, in 2016, to help spearhead efforts on Capitol Hill in support of a court challenge. President Trump called me last night and I was encouraged to hear his continued resolve to ensure that every legal vote gets properly counted and that all instances of fraud and illegality are investigated and prosecuted, Johnson tweeted on November 9, 2020. Weeks later, after Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, Republican, filed suit seeking to challenge the voting practices in a number of swing states that Biden had won, Johnson was tasked with whipping House support as the case made its way to the Supreme Court. To do this, Johnson, who had sway as head of the Republican Study Group, a conservative policy group in the House, assiduously allied himself with Trump. He used that connection in writing a December 9. Johnson wrote that Trump had called him and asked me to contact all Republican members of the House and Senate today and request that all join on to our brief. The brief said it represented the concerns of members of Congress, shared by untold millions of their constituents, that the unconstitutional irregularities involved in the 2020 presidential election cast doubt upon its outcome and the integrity of the American system of elections. Trump had boosted the case, tweeting that it was very strong. Johnson's role was so central that the brief's cover page reads, U.S. Representative Mike Johnson and 125 other members of the U.S. House of Representatives. The Supreme Court quickly threw out the case, saying on December 11, 2020, that Texas did not have standing. Trump tweeted that the court had really let us down. No wisdom, no courage. In the wake of the brief's failure, some Republicans complained to Johnson that they felt he had unfairly pressured them to sign on to the filing by invoking Trump's name, according to a former House Republican senior aide who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe private conversations. Johnson told his colleagues that he was sorry if they felt pressured, according to the aide, who was on the call in which Johnson made the comment. After the case was tossed out, Johnson was asked by The New Yorker why he thought Trump's legal team had failed in an array of legal challenges. He stood by the legal claims and asserted that the problem was that Trump didn't have enough good lawyers. It appears that some of the larger law firms that might have been lined up early on, for whatever reason backed out, and Rudy Giuliani was in charge, Johnson said, referring to the former New York City mayor. And I don't think their army of lawyers was large enough. Constitutional scholars disagreed, saying that in addition to the lack of standing, the lawsuit was attempting to challenge voting rules after the election had passed rather than in advance, when the procedures had been adopted. It was an effort to confer some patina of legitimacy on what was essentially an illegitimate and dangerous move to overthrow an election, said Representative Jamie B. Raskin, Democrat, Maryland, who was a member of the House's January 6 committee. Following the lawsuit's failure, Johnson began trying to gather support to prevent the certification of the Electoral College vote for Biden. On January 5, 2021, one day before Congress was slated to vote on certification, Johnson met with other members of the Republican caucus to discuss how to overturn the election results. Johnson argued that some states had changed their voting rules as a result of the pandemic, which he said was unconstitutional, and validated his effort not to certify Biden's election, according to a recording of the session reported by the New York Times. Johnson later told the Times that he never believed claims that Trump lost due to massive fraud, but instead said he told colleagues, "Guys, you don't have to worry about any of that. They violated the Constitution." Johnson did, in fact, share fantastical claims of fraud, including one that Dominion voting systems as election equipment originated under the late Venezuelan dictator Hugo Chávez's communist regime. As Johnson met with Republican colleagues in the House's Visitor Center auditorium January 5, he laid out his case. While there were a number of members in the meeting who objected to his argument, many of those listening had been among those who signed Johnson's amicus brief, held him in high regard and applauded his effort, according to a former Republican staffer familiar with the session. Johnson was leading the debate, and members used his case to rationalize why they objected to the certification, the staffer said, speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss a private session. In the aftermath of the attack by pro-Trump rioters on the Capitol, Johnson contacted Cassidy Hutchinson, an aide to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, to inquire about whether there was an effort underway to try to remove Trump under the 25th Amendment, according to Hutchinson's testimony to the January 6 committee. "Has Mark heard about the 25th Amendment? Does he think it's going to happen?" Johnson asked, according to Hutchinson. She said she took his query as a conversational effort to pick up on what was being said at the White House. The January 6 committee did not subpoena Johnson about his involvement, although lawyers for the committee did question some witnesses about his actions, according to its records. But one email released by the committee underscored how controversial some of those actions were perceived to be. The email from then-Rep. Mo Brooks, Republican, Alabama, saying it was pursuant to a request from Matt Gaetz, the Florida Republican who later engineered the ouster of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, recommended that Trump pardon every Republican who signed the amicus brief in the Texas lawsuit, referring to the filing led by Johnson. Most experts say the Trump-led pressure campaign following the 2020 election aimed at Vice President Mike Pence would be much harder to execute now because of changes to the Electoral Count Act limiting the ability of Congress to object to results submitted by the states. But there is still cause for concern, several scholars said. Richard H. Pildes, a New York University law professor, said the Speaker would have significant power to shape the rules if neither candidate wins an outright majority of Electoral College votes, a possibility if a third-party candidate manages to win one or more states. In that scenario, a contingent election would occur in the House, where each state's delegation is given one vote. A more alarming concern is whether Johnson would, assuming he's still Speaker after the next election, attempt to disrupt the proceedings in a more dramatic way, for instance, by preventing the session from happening altogether. Although the Vice President presides over the occasion, it occurs in the House chamber, the domain of the Speaker. What if the House refuses to participate, speculated Edward B. Foley, a law professor and election law expert at Ohio State University, referring to the hypothetical possibility that the House might disregard its statutory obligations under the new Electoral Count Reform Act. And what if, Foley added, Congress failed to finalize the results by January 20, Inauguration Day? Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would no longer be president and vice president. A constitutional crisis over their succession could ensue. Johnson, as Speaker, would be next in line. Foley quickly noted that he believes it's a far-fetched scenario. But the events of January 6, 2021, would have seemed far-fetched before they actually occurred, too, he said. Jacqueline Alamani contributed to this report. Dean Phillips's primary challenge of Biden will face many obstacles. Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips is expected to announce his presidential intentions in New Hampshire on Friday. Democratic strategists say it's unlikely to undermine Biden's path to the nomination. Political scion Robert F. Kennedy Jr. running as a Democrat could have spelled trouble for President Biden, but his decision to run as an independent made his candidacy at least as much of a problem for Republicans in the short term. Progressive scholar Cornel West left the Green Party to similarly run as an independent, mucking up his ability to get his name on the ballot. And Democratic groups have moved to squash a third-party presidential ticket supported by centrist organization No Labels. Enter Representative Dean Phillips, Democrat, Minnesota. In a last-ditch effort to provide a Democratic or third-party alternative to Biden, Phillips will be launching a primary challenge on Friday, seizing on Biden's anemic approval ratings among key Democratic constituencies and wariness over his age. He is expected to officially announce his bid at the New Hampshire State House, where candidates file to make it onto the state's primary ballot, and then begin a bus tour. But Phillips throwing his hat into the Democratic primary ring is unlikely to undermine Biden's chance of securing the nomination, according to Democratic strategists, highlighting the clear path Biden has faced to the general election despite dissatisfaction from within his party and questions about his electability. Phillips's last-minute entry follows months of successful efforts by Biden's team to remove obstacles to the president's renomination. White House aides oversaw a reshuffling of the first nominating states last year, demoting both Iowa and New Hampshire, where Biden placed 4th and 5th in 2020. They signed up many of his highest-profile rivals, including Democratic governors and senators, to a surrogate operation that has made them public champions of Biden's re-election. The Democratic National Committee also marginalized the early announced rivals for the nomination, author Marianne Williamson and Kennedy, refusing to entertain primary debates or to give them a platform on which to run. Kennedy announced in October that he would run as an independent, a relief for Biden aides, a move that will now force him to spend much of the next few months trying to arrange state ballot access. All of this has been accomplished despite Biden's historically alarming polling within the Democratic Party. A CNN poll in September found that 67% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents said they wanted a different candidate as the party's nominee. 60% of the same group said they were seriously concerned about his ability to win the 2024 election if chosen as the nominee. Phillips, 54, said such numbers show how Democratic voters are seeking an alternative to the incumbent. He had hinted about this run, first suggesting in August that he wasn't planning on running at that time but thought Biden should step aside for some Democratic star, naming moderate Democratic governors as alternatives. "I'm representing what I believe to be the majority of the country that wants to turn the page," he said on NBC's Meet the Press. "Tired of the meanness and the fearmongering of Donald Trump. I would like to see Joe Biden, a wonderful and remarkable man, pass the torch, cement this extraordinary legacy." In a recent signal of the pending campaign, Phillips stepped down from his leadership role as the co-chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, citing how his convictions relative to the 2024 presidential race are incongruent with the majority of his caucus. Some Democrats have agreed with Phillips, arguing it is better for the party to have a real debate over Biden's re-election now, even if the time is rapidly dwindling. They have raised concerns that third-party contenders, like Kennedy and West, or a possible moderate ticket by the group No Labels, could undermine Biden in a general election. Meanwhile, Biden's team has long thought that the Democratic doubts about Biden will dissipate once it becomes clear that Biden is the only alternative to returning former President Donald Trump to the White House. Trump has so far dominated the race for the GOP nomination. "The idea that this should not be aired out and should be discussed in hushed tones is ludicrous," said James Carville, a former political advisor to President Bill Clinton. "This needs to be discussed." But Phillips has already missed the Nevada filing deadline and will have to follow his New Hampshire performance with a contest against Biden in South Carolina, a state the president credits with setting him on the path to the nomination. Phillips's national name identification, unlike Kennedy's, is negligible. And he has a long history of supporting Biden. "I'm so grateful America elected Joe Biden to be our president," Phillips posted on Twitter, now called X, after Biden gave his first joint address to Congress. Phillips has voted consistently with Biden, and it remains unclear what his message would be to voters about how he distinguishes himself from his party's leader. Phillips's entry into the race will come only days after the Biden campaign officially informed the New Hampshire Democratic Party the president will not submit his name to appear on the state's primary ballot. In a letter to the state party on Tuesday, Julie Chavez Rodriguez, Biden's campaign manager, said Biden was obligated to comply with DNC rules and the National Party urged Democratic campaigns not to file for New Hampshire's ballot because the state is holding a primary outside the order approved by the DNC. Even without Biden's name on the ballot, many Democrats still expect the president will still win the unsanctioned primary as a write-in candidate. The reality is that Joe Biden will win the New Hampshire first-in-the-nation primary in January, win renomination in Chicago, and will be re-elected next November, Ray Buckley, the chair of the New Hampshire Democratic Party, said in a statement. "New Hampshire voters know and trust Joe Biden, that's why he is leading Trump in New Hampshire by double digits." Some Democratic strategists predict Phillips would struggle to be recognized by voters outside of Minnesota, who probably don't know the businessman who formerly was the president and CEO of his family's distilling business, which includes brands such as Ju.dy Vodka and Ran Talenti Gelato. In 2018, he won his first political office and flipped Minnesota's 3rd congressional district, which had been a GOP stronghold. But outside of Washington and the suburbs of the Twin Cities, Phillips has gone unrecognized. His financial fortune could be useful for him, as most Democratic donors are tied to Biden. Phillips has $20.5 million to $70 million in assets, according to last year's disclosure report. Rebecca Piercy, political director and senior advisor for Senator Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign, said his campaign doesn't merit much attention from the Biden-Harris team. As much as Phillips talks about Biden's age, he has little influence to change the minds of voters about America's oldest president. "We all know how old Biden is," she said. "I don't think a 2.5-term congressman who is probably not actually known outside his district is the challenge that Biden would need in order to lose this nomination." Phillips also would not be able to match the advanced infrastructure of Democratic support for Biden's bid on a local, state and federal level. While Biden's campaign itself has a relatively small but growing staff, the DNC has ballooned in size and provides fundraising, organizing and volunteer support for the Biden operation in conjunction with every state's Democratic Party. Piercy said there are better ways for Phillips to talk about the Democratic agenda than creating his own agenda with no name and his bus tour in New Hampshire and going on this delusional run against an entire institution that has 57 states and territories set up with Biden-Harris staff, volunteers, and the DNC. "It's beyond me how someone wakes up and is like, this is what I'm going to do," she added. Steve Schmidt, a veteran Republican political strategist, is advising Phillips's campaign and is intimately involved in Friday's launch, according to two people familiar with the campaign. Schmidt worked on the presidential campaigns of George W. Bush and John McCain before disavowing Trump and his party, and helped former Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz explore a 2020 presidential run. Like other Democratic strategists, Joe Trippi, a senior advisor for the Lincoln Project, a centrist PAC, said that he would have advised Phillips to stay out of the race. Trippi, who managed the unsuccessful 2004 presidential campaign of long-shot candidate Howard Dean, said there are plenty of other instances of candidates who have attempted to run as an insurgent to their own party's establishment. But Phillips has even those who have supported those previous runs scratching their heads. "This entry has to be among the most clueless I've ever seen," Trippi said. Democrats close to Phillips expressed their own frustration as well. Representative Chrissy Houlihan, Democrat, Pennsylvania, who came to Congress the same year as Phillips and has worked closely with him, called his presidential ambitions perplexing. But she was quick to add that she also didn't see Phillips as much of a threat to Biden, who she has endorsed and expects to win her divided suburban Philadelphia district. "I don't have a lot of concerns, to be honest," she said. "I believe the Biden campaign is preparing to be the nominee. I believe that this is a distraction, and one that will likely be a relatively short-lived one. We need to be unified, and we need to be focused." Ken Martin, the chair of the Minnesota Democratic Farmer-Labor Party, said he is highly disappointed by Phillips's presidential run. Martin said he hasn't talked to Phillips in months and still hasn't received any communication from him about his planned run. As someone who worked really hard to get him elected in the first place and helped recruit him to run, it's frustrating that he's willing to blow all of his political capital on a wild goose chase, he said. And as evidence of Phillips's long-shot bid, next week, Biden plans to travel to Minnesota for a campaign fundraiser, at which many of Phillips's donors are expected to be in attendance, according to a person familiar with the event. Ins Morse contributed to this report.